The day had started like any other, with the same routines of household chores, the same conversations over breakfast, and the same silent distance that had grown between me and my husband. He left early for work, his eyes glued to his phone, his mind already consumed by his business meetings. I stood at the doorway watching him drive away, feeling that familiar emptiness creep into my chest. It wasn't that I didn't love him. It was that somewhere along the way, the warmth had faded, replaced by formality and routine. Our conversations were practical, our moments together mechanical. The spark that once kept me smiling through the day had dimmed, and I felt invisible in my own marriage. It was during this stretch of loneliness that I met him, my private tutor. I had joined an evening language course just for myself, to break the monotony of my life, but soon discovered that attending classes wasn't enough. I needed more practice, more guidance. When he offered to tutor me at home, it seemed harmless at first. After all, what could be wrong with extra lessons? He was polite, respectful, and always carried himself with a confidence that quietly drew attention. That afternoon, when I stood outside his home for the first time, I felt a nervous flutter in my stomach. The street was quiet, lined with small houses and blooming trees, the kind of place where every neighbor probably knew each other's routine. I checked the time, 5 minutes early. Taking a deep breath, I rang the bell. He opened the door almost immediately, his smile calm, yet inviting. "You're right on time," he said, stepping aside to let me in. The living room smelled faintly of coffee and books, a mix of warmth and intellect. Shelves stacked with novels and journals covered one wall, and his desk was neatly arranged with papers and pens. It was a space that reflected both discipline and solitude. That we sat across from each other at the small study table, the initial moments filled with casual talk about lessons, about what I found difficult and what I hoped to improve. His voice was steady, his words precise, and yet there was a softness in the way he explained things. He wasn't just a tutor. He was a listener, someone who paid attention to the little details I shared, even when they weren't about the subject. As the minutes passed, I found myself leaning in, drawn to his way of speaking, the way his eyes occasionally locked with mine before shifting back to the notebook. There was a subtle tension in the room, one I tried to ignore, but it lingered like an unsaid thought. He noticed it too. I could sense it in the pauses between his words, the slight smile that played at the corner of his lips. At one point, he suggested moving to his study room, saying it would be quieter there. Without hesitation, I agreed, even though my heart skipped a beat at the idea of stepping deeper into his private space. The room was smaller than I expected, with a single bed pushed against the wall and a window that let in the golden rays of the evening sun. The air felt warmer here, more intimate, as though the walls themselves held secrets. I sat down at the edge of the bed with my notebook while he adjusted some papers on his desk. For a moment, I watched him, noticing things I hadn't before, the way his shoulders moved beneath his shirt, the quiet confidence in his posture. When he finally turned back to me, our eyes met again, and this time neither of us looked away immediately. There was something dangerous about that silence, something magnetic that neither of us tried to break. My mind told me I was here for learning, that this was just a class, but my heart whispered otherwise. I felt alive in that moment in a way I hadn't in years, seen, noticed, desired. And though nothing had been said, the unspoken words hung heavy in the room, waiting for the next step to unfold. The days that followed were filled with an anticipation I couldn't quite explain. Every time I thought about those few quiet moments in his study room, the silence, the lingering glances, I felt a rush of emotions I had buried for years. My husband came home late as usual, his attention divided between his work calls and the dinner table. I smiled, I nodded, I performed the role of a dutiful wife. But inside, my mind kept wandering back to that small room with the golden light spilling through the window, and the man who looked at me like he could read my every thought. That I told myself it was nothing, just an innocent attraction, a moment of weakness. But when he messaged me a day later asking if I wanted another lesson, I agreed instantly. I didn't even pause to consider the reasons or the consequences. It was as if something inside me craved that space, that presence, more than the lessons themselves. This time, I dressed with a care I hadn't in months. Nothing extravagant, just a simple dress that flowed easily and made me feel comfortable. But the fact that I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual, adjusting my hair, touching up my lips, revealed the truth I wasn't ready to say out loud. I wanted to be noticed by him, wanted to feel that spark again. When I arrived, he welcomed me with the same calm smile, but I sensed a change in his eyes. Perhaps it was my imagination. Or perhaps he too had spent the last few days replaying those silent moments. We started with the books, of course, because that was the excuse that brought me there. But very quickly, the lessons blurred into conversations that had nothing to do with the subject that we spoke of life, of dreams, of disappointments. I found myself telling him things I had never said aloud, that I felt unseen in my own home, that I longed for laughter that had slowly disappeared from my days, that I felt as though I had been reduced to routines and responsibilities. He listened without judgment, his eyes never leaving mine, and when he finally spoke, his words felt like they were meant to stitch the pieces of me back together. "You deserve to be happy," he said softly. Just 4 words, but they struck deeper than I expected. No one had said that to me in years. I swallowed hard, feeling a lump rise in my throat. For a moment, I wanted to cry, not from sadness but from the release of emotions I had kept locked away at some point. We moved again into his study room. It felt natural now, almost as if the living room was too open, too exposed for the kinds of conversations we were having. In that smaller space, time slowed down. He sat closer to me this time, his notebook open but forgotten between us. The air grew heavy with unspoken words, with emotions that hovered dangerously on the edge of crossing boundaries that I noticed the way his hand brushed lightly against mine as he pointed to a line in the notebook. The touch was accidental, or maybe it wasn't, but it sent a shiver down my arm. My heart pounded, and though I told myself to stay composed, my breath betrayed me, coming faster than before. "Are you all right?" he asked, his tone gentle but knowing that I nodded, unable to form a proper answer. The truth was I wasn't all right. I was alive, too alive, in a way that felt both intoxicating and terrifying. The silence stretched again, and in that silence, everything spoke louder than words. His eyes searched mine, asking questions I couldn't dare to answer aloud. My hand trembled slightly on the page, and before I realized it, he had placed his hand over mine, not forcefully, but in a way that felt protective, almost tender. That single gesture broke something inside me. The walls I had built, the promises I had kept, the guilt that held me back, all of it cracked in that instant. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. Instead, I let the warmth of his hand seep into mine, filling a void I had carried for far too long. That we didn't move closer yet, didn't speak of what was happening. But it was clear. The boundary between teacher and student, between innocent lessons and forbidden emotions, had already been crossed. What lay ahead was uncertain, perhaps even dangerous, but for the first time in years, I didn't care. I was tired of being invisible. And here, in this quiet room, with him watching me like I was the only person in the world, I felt seen. Truly seen. The next few days blurred together in a haze of restlessness. I went about my routines as if nothing had changed, but inside, everything was different. Every time I folded the laundry, every time I prepared a meal, every time I sat across from my husband at the dinner table while he scrolled endlessly on his phone, my thoughts drifted back to that moment in the study. The way his hand had rested on mine, the way silence had spoken louder than words. It was as though a door had opened inside me, and no matter how much I tried to shut it, I couldn't. I found myself waiting for his messages. Just a few words. "Are you free tomorrow?" were enough to set my pulse racing. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that these were just extra lessons, nothing more, but my heart knew better. Each meeting wasn't about the books anymore. It was about the way I felt when I was near him, about rediscovering a version of myself I thought had been lost forever. When I arrived at his house again, it felt strangely familiar now, like stepping into a world where I could shed the weight of who I was expected to be. He welcomed me with that same calm smile, but this time, it lingered longer, carrying with it a quiet acknowledgement of what was unfolding between us. We began as usual, flipping through notebooks, talking about sentences and meanings. But it was only a matter of minutes before our focus shifted. He asked me about my week, and I confessed more than I intended, that my husband and I hadn't really spoken in days, that the silence at home felt suffocating. He listened carefully, his eyes steady on mine, and when I faltered, he gently said, "You don't have to pretend with me." Those words disarmed me. I didn't realize how much I had been pretending, how much of myself I had hidden behind smiles and nods. With him, the mask slipped away, and for once, I didn't feel the need to hold them up at some point. The books were forgotten altogether. We sat side by side, our shoulders brushing lightly, a closeness that sent waves of heat through me. My breath caught, and I turned slightly, only to find his eyes already fixed on me. The air grew heavier, charged with something that neither of us could deny anymore. Do you ever think about what you really want? He asked softly. The question lingered between us, dangerous and yet irresistible. I swallowed hard, my voice barely above a whisper. All the time. And in that instant, something shifted. He leaned closer, not rushing, not forcing, but with a patience that made the moment all the more intense. I could feel the warmth of his breath, the hesitation in the space between us. My heart raced so loudly I was certain he could hear it. When his hand reached for mine again, I didn't resist. This time, I held on tightly, as though I had been waiting for this touch all my life. The world outside that small room ceased to exist. There was no husband, no duties, no judgment. Only the two of us, suspended in a moment we both knew was forbidden yet unstoppable. That I don't know who moved first, whether it was me or him. Perhaps it didn't matter. All I remember is the slow closing of the distance, the way our lips hovered just a breath apart before finally meeting. It wasn't hurried or desperate, it was deliberate, charged with all the unspoken words we had carried until now. The kiss was soft at first, almost questioning, but it deepened quickly, as though years of silence and longing had erupted in a single spark. My hands trembled as I touched his shoulder, feeling the steady strength beneath. His arms circled gently around me, pulling me closer, and for the first time in years, I felt a rush of warmth that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with desire. When we finally pulled away, breathless, there was a silence between us again. But this time, it wasn't awkward or uncertain. It was filled with a dangerous clarity. We both knew what had just happened, what it meant, and what it could cost. But instead of fear, I felt alive. I shouldn't have, I started. But he stopped me with a quiet shake of his head. You wanted this as much as I did, he said, his voice steady, his eyes searching mine. And he was right. I couldn't deny it. For the first time, I didn't want to deny it. I left his house that evening. The streets seemed brighter, the air sharper. I walked quickly, clutching my bag, my lips still tingling from his touch. Guilt lurked somewhere deep inside, whispering its warnings, but it was drowned out by a louder, more intoxicating voice. The voice that said I had finally woken up from a long sleep. The days that followed were unlike anything I had known before. My world became a strange balance of ordinary routines and extraordinary secrets. In the daylight, I played the role of a wife, cooking meals, folding clothes, smiling politely at my husband's distracted presence. But in the evenings, my thoughts belonged somewhere else entirely. They belonged to him, his words, his gaze, the warmth of his touch that had awakened a part of me I thought had died long ago. Each time I visited, the line between lessons and something more blurred further until the books were just props, forgotten on the desk as we sat closer, speaking in hushed tones, sharing confessions that deepened our bond. Every stolen moment carried a thrill, but also a quiet dread. We both knew what we were doing was dangerous, that it was a betrayal of promises once made. But the gravity of what pulled us together was stronger than the fear of consequences. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the study room in a golden half-light, I found myself resting against him, my head on his shoulder. The world felt peaceful in that silence, as if everything I had longed for had finally materialized in one fleeting moment. Do you ever regret this? I asked softly, my voice trembling with the weight of guilt I carried. He was quiet for a long time before answering. Regret? No. Fear, yes, but not regret. His honesty pierced through me, leaving me both relieved and unsettled. I realized then that we weren't just playing with feelings. We were living inside a choice that could reshape both our lives. The intensity of our connection only grew. We laughed together, we lingered in silences, and when our lips met, it was with a passion that blurred everything else. In his presence, I wasn't invisible. I was alive, cherished, desired. And yet, when I returned home, I couldn't shake the duality of my existence. My husband's indifference no longer simply hurt. It felt like a chasm widening with every secret I carried. The turning point came unexpectedly. My husband, in a rare moment of attention, mentioned that he had noticed my absences, the way I often left the house in the evenings. He asked casually, without suspicion, but the question made my heart race. I replied with half-truths, saying I had been taking lessons to improve myself, which wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. His nod and disinterest should have relieved me, but instead, it deepened the ache inside me. How could a man be so unconcerned, so detached, that he didn't even question further? That night, as I lay beside him, staring at the ceiling, I realized something unsettling. My infidelity wasn't born purely out of rebellion or recklessness. It was born out of longing for attention, for intimacy, for a sense of being alive. And in a twisted way, it wasn't just betrayal. It was survival. The next time I met my tutor, I told him what had happened, how my husband had asked questions but shown no real interest. He looked at me with quiet intensity, then said, "You deserve more than silence. But you also need to decide what it is you truly want. Me, or the life you're holding on to." His words struck hard because they were true. I was living in two worlds, clinging to both, yet belonging fully to neither. My heart longed to be free, but my mind whispered warnings of consequences too heavy to bear. That evening, as we sat together, I held his hand tightly and whispered, "I don't know the future. I don't know what choices I'll have the courage to make. But I know that what I feel for you is real, more real than anything I've felt in years." He pressed my hand gently, his expression calm but unreadable. Sometimes love comes in places we never expect. It's not always simple, and it's not always right, but it's real. As I walked home that night, my heart was torn between two worlds, one of duty and routine, the other of passion and forbidden love. The guilt weighed heavy, yet the memory of his embrace burned brighter than the shame that I didn't have answers, only choices waiting to be made. But one thing was certain: I could never return to the emptiness I had known before. Something inside me had shifted forever, and no matter where life led me, I would carry with me the memory of the man who, under the pretext of tuition, had shown me a version of myself I thought I had lost. And as the night settled around me, I realized that some stories don't end with clarity or clean lines. Some stories live in the spaces between what we want and what we can have, in the secret rooms, the stolen glances, the forbidden touches. That was my story now. An infidelity, yes, but also a love story. One that would haunt me, even as it kept me alive.